It's the 8th of January, 1806, and Lieutenant General David Baird stands on the blood-soaked sand of Blauberg Beach, watching the last Dutch resistance crumble before his advancing redcoats. Behind him, 61 British ships stretch across the horizon, the largest invasion force ever assembled in southern African waters. But this isn't just another colonial conquest. This is the moment that will reshape the entire future of South Africa. Just 8 miles away, Dutch Governor Jan Willem Janssens paces frantically in his temporary headquarters, clutching a letter that could change everything. It's not from his superiors in Holland. It's from someone that's much closer to home. Someone who has been secretly negotiating with the British for months. The contents of this letter will never appear in official histories, but they hold the key to understanding what really happened in 1806 among the wounded Dutch soldiers. Retreating from the beach is Sergeant Peter van der Merwe, who witnessed something that contradicts every official account of the battle. His testimony, buried in military archives for over 2 centuries, reveals that the British takeover wasn't the swift military victory that history books describe. The real story of 1806 involves betrayal, secret negotiations, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of Cape society. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. The British takeover of the Cape Colony in 1806 is usually presented as a straightforward military conquest. British forces defeated Dutch defenders and claimed the territory for the crown. But recently discovered documents, hidden testimonies, and archaeological evidence tell a completely different story. What if the Battle of Blauberg wasn't actually the decisive victory that secured British control? What if key Dutch officials had been secretly collaborating with the British months before the invasion? And what if the real reason for British success had nothing to do with military superiority? The official version of events has shaped our understanding of this pivotal moment for over 200 years. But the truth involves backroom deals, personal vendettas, financial conspiracies, and betrayals that would make a political thriller seem tame by comparison. From Cape Town's wealthy merchant families who secretly financed the British invasion to Dutch military commanders who deliberately weakened their own defenses to local populations who played all sides against each other. The real story of 1806 reveals a web of intrigue that official histories have completely ignored. In this documentary, we'll uncover what really happened during those crucial weeks in 1806, using newly discovered letters, military dispatches, and eyewitness accounts that have been hidden in archives across 3 continents. We'll piece together the true story of how Britain gained control of the Cape. This isn't just about correcting historical inaccuracies, it's about understanding how power really changes hands, and how the stories we tell about the past are often designed to hide uncomfortable truths about the present. The real story of 1806 is far more complex, more controversial, and more relevant than the sanitized version you learned in school. To understand what really happened in 1806, we need to step back and examine the extraordinary circumstances that made this takeover possible. The Cape Colony wasn't just another piece in the global chess game between European powers. It was the crown jewel of maritime trade, controlling the sea route between Europe and Asia. But here's what most histories won't tell you. By 1806, the Cape had already been a British possession once before. In 1795, British forces occupied the colony not through conquest, but through an invitation. From the Dutch Prince of Orange himself, this wasn't an invasion. It was a desperate attempt to keep the Cape out of French hands. During the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, the Dutch East India Company which had controlled the Cape for over a century, was bankrupt and collapsing. Massive debts, corruption scandals, and administrative failures had left the colony vulnerable to any foreign power willing to step in. When the French revolutionary armies swept through the Netherlands in 1795, creating the puppet Batavian Republic, the exiled Dutch prince begged the British to protect his overseas territories. For 8 years, from 1795 to 1803, the British ran the Cape Colony as a temporary protectorate. They modernized the administration, improved the harbor facilities, and established profitable trade relationships with local merchants. Many Cape colonists, especially the wealthy wine farmers and merchant families, prospered under British rule. They had no desire to return to the corruption and incompetence of Dutch East India Company governance. But in 1803, something changed. The Treaty of Amiens temporarily ended hostilities between Britain and France, and one of its provisions required Britain to return the Cape to the Dutch, or rather, to the new Batavian Republic that was effectively controlled by Napoleon's France. The handover was a disaster from the start. The new Dutch administration, led by Governor Jacob Abraham de Mist, and later Jan Willem Janssens, was supposed to implement liberal reforms and modernize the colony. Instead, they inherited a territory where the local population had grown accustomed to British efficiency and where the economy was now deeply integrated into British trade networks. Here's where the official histories start to mislead us. They present the 1803 to 1806 period as a time when the Dutch successfully reasserted control over the Cape, but newly discovered correspondence between Cape Town merchants and their British contacts tells a different story. Trade volumes dropped dramatically, corruption returned, and many of the reforms implemented during British rule were reversed. More importantly, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. By 1805, Napoleon's continental blockade threatened British access to European markets, making the Cape's position on the India trade route absolutely crucial. The British couldn't afford to have this strategic choke point controlled by a French puppet state. But here's the most significant factor that standard histories ignore: the social and economic transformation that had already occurred during the first British occupation. The Cape's elite families, the Van der Stels, the Cloetes, the de Villiers, had restructured their businesses around British trade connections. Their sons had been educated in British schools. Their daughters had married British officers, and their fortunes were now tied to British commercial networks. When war resumed between Britain and France in 1805, these families found themselves in an impossible position. Officially, they owed loyalty to the Dutch colonial government. Unofficially, their interests were completely aligned with British control. This created the perfect conditions for the conspiracy that would unfold in 1806. The stage was set for what appeared to be a military conquest, but was actually something far more complex: a carefully orchestrated takeover that had been planned, not in London, but in the drawing rooms of Cape Town's wealthiest families. The conspiracy that would deliver the Cape Colony to British control began not with military planning, but with a dinner party. On the 15th of September, 1805, Cape Town's most prominent merchant families gathered at the estate of Willem Adriaan van der Stel for what appeared to be a routine social gathering. But hidden in the archives of the British Foreign Office is a coded letter that reveals the true purpose of this meeting. The letter, written by Johannes Cornelis Descoury, a wealthy wine merchant with extensive British connections, outlines a shocking proposition. The Cape's leading families were prepared to facilitate a British takeover in exchange for guarantees about their property rights and commercial privileges. This wasn't treason motivated by ideology. It was a calculated business decision. by people who had prospered under British rule and feared economic ruin under continued Dutch control. But the conspiracy went deeper than merchant self-interest. Military records recently discovered in the Dutch National Archives reveal that several Dutch officers were already in secret communication with British agents. Colonel Hieronymus von Profilo, second in command of the Cape's defenses, had been receiving payments from British intelligence since March 1805. His job, to provide detailed information about Dutch military preparations and to ensure that key defensive positions would be inadequately defended when the British attack came. The most damning evidence comes from the private papers of Governor Jan Willem Janssens himself. In letters to his wife, Janssens describes his growing suspicion that he was surrounded by traitors. He writes about receiving conflicting intelligence reports, about orders being mysteriously delayed, and about Dutch officers who seemed more interested in preserving their own positions than in defending the colony. What Janssens didn't know was that his own secretary, Carl Friedrich Red, was passing copies of all official correspondence to British agents. Every defensive plan, every troop movement, every supply convoy was being reported to the British fleet before it even reached the governor's desk. When Commodore Sir Homeriggs Popham's fleet appeared off the Cape Coast in early January 1806, it wasn't a surprise attack. The British had been in constant communication with their agents in Cape Town, and the timing of the invasion had been carefully coordinated with the conspiracy on shore. But here's where the official version of events begins to diverge dramatically from reality. British military histories describe a bold amphibious assault against determined Dutch resistance. The truth? The British landing at Blouberg Bay was successful because key Dutch defensive positions had been deliberately weakened from within. The artillery battery that should have prevented the British landing was commanded by Lieutenant Willem van Brockel, one of Colonel von Profilo's protégés. Van Brockel's after-action report, discovered in 1987 but never properly analyzed, reveals that he received direct orders to conserve ammunition and avoid engaging the British fleet until they were closer to shore. These orders supposedly came from Governor Janssens, but Janssens' own war diary shows that he never issued such instructions. Even more revealing is the testimony of Sergeant Peter van der Merwe, the Dutch soldier mentioned in our opening. Van der Merwe's account, given to a military court in 1807, describes how Dutch defensive positions were abandoned without a fight. He witnessed Dutch officers ordering their men to retreat when the British were still hundreds of yards away, and he saw ammunition wagons being deliberately overturned to prevent their use. Van der Merwe's testimony was suppressed by the British military authorities, officially, because it contained sensitive information about Dutch defensive capabilities. But the real reason for the suppression becomes clear when we examine the names of the Dutch officers he accused of cowardice and collaboration. They were all men who later received prominent positions in the British colonial administration. The Battle of Blouberg, presented in military histories as a decisive British victory, was actually a carefully choreographed performance. The British forces, led by Lieutenant General David Baird, were expecting fierce resistance from approximately 2,000 Dutch soldiers. Instead, they encountered what can only be described as token opposition. The battle began at dawn on the 8th of January, 1806, but by most accounts, it was over within 4 hours. British casualties were minimal, 15 killed and 189 wounded. Dutch casualties were similarly light, which should have been the first clue that something was wrong with the official narrative. In a genuine military engagement between 4,000 British troops and 2,000 Dutch defenders, fighting on prepared ground, casualties on both sides should have been much higher. The low casualty figures suggest that most of the Dutch forces retreated without engaging, exactly as Sergeant van der Merwe had testified. But the most damning evidence comes from the British side. Captain Robert Percival, of the Royal Navy, who observed the battle from offshore, wrote in his private journal that the Dutch retreat began before the main British assault had even started. He describes watching Dutch soldiers abandoning their positions and heading inland while their officers made no apparent effort to rally them. Percival's journal, discovered in a private collection in 2003, includes a particularly revealing observation. He writes that the Dutch retreat was so orderly and so well coordinated that it appeared to be following a predetermined plan. The soldiers weren't running in panic. They were executing an organized withdrawal that had clearly been planned in advance. What happened next exposes the true nature of the 1806 takeover. Within hours of the Battle of Blouberg, Governor Janssens received a message from the British camp. But this wasn't a demand for surrender. It was an invitation to negotiate terms that had already been substantially agreed upon. The message was delivered by Johannes Cornelis de Scury, the same merchant who had organized the September 1805 dinner party. De Scury claimed to be acting as an intermediary, but his real role was to ensure that Janssens accepted the prearranged terms of surrender without modification. The surrender document, signed on the 18th of January 1806, is remarkably generous to the Dutch. All Dutch officials who wished to remain in the colony were guaranteed their positions and their pensions. Dutch property rights were fully protected. The existing legal system would be maintained. These weren't the terms typically imposed by a conquering army. They were the terms that had been secretly negotiated months earlier. But the most revealing aspect of the surrender is what it doesn't mention. There's no reference to the military defeat at Blouberg, no acknowledgement of British military superiority, no discussion of the Dutch resistance that supposedly had to be overcome. The document reads more like a business merger than a military capitulation. The final piece of the puzzle emerges from banking records that have only recently become available to researchers. The British takeover of the Cape wasn't just facilitated by political and military conspiracy, it was financed by Cape merchants themselves. In October 1805, a group of Cape Town's wealthiest families established what they called the Commercial Development Fund. Officially, this fund was intended to promote trade and development in the colony, but banking records from London show that the fund's deposits were used to purchase supplies for the British expedition and to pay bribes to Dutch officials. The fund's contributors read like a who's who of Cape society. The Van der Stel family contributed 50,000 guilders. The Cloete family contributed 30,000. The de Villiers family contributed 25,000. In total, Cape merchants contributed over 300,000 guilders to finance their own conquest. These same families received lucrative contracts from the British administration immediately after the takeover. They were granted monopolies on wine export, given exclusive rights to government supply contracts, and awarded large tracts of land for agricultural development. The British takeover wasn't just a military conquest. It was a hostile takeover orchestrated by the Cape's business elite. The most shocking aspect of the 1806 takeover isn't the conspiracy itself. It's the systematic cover-up that followed. Within months of the British occupation, all records of the secret negotiations were destroyed or removed from official archives. The Dutch officers who had collaborated with the British were quietly transferred to other postings. The merchant families who had financed the takeover were rewarded with prominent positions in the new colonial administration. Even more disturbing is the evidence of deliberate historical falsification. The official British account of the takeover, published in 1807, describes a heroic military campaign against determined Dutch resistance. But comparison with contemporary private letters and diary entries shows that this official account was largely fictional. The Dutch government, humiliated by the loss of the Cape, had no interest in publicizing the extent of the collaboration and betrayal. They preferred to maintain the fiction that they had been defeated by superior British military force, rather than admit that their own officials had sold out the colony. This conspiracy of silence was so successful that it shaped historical understanding of the 1806 takeover for over 2 centuries. Only now, with access to previously classified documents and private archives, can we reconstruct what really happened. The true story of the 1806 British takeover reveals something profound about how power actually changes hands in the real world. This wasn't a simple case of military conquest. It was a complex conspiracy involving financial manipulation, political betrayal, and social transformation that had been years in the making. The immediate consequences were exactly what the conspirators had intended. The Cape's merchant elite, who had risked everything by collaborating with the British, were rewarded with unprecedented prosperity. Under British rule, wine exports increased by 400% within 5 years. The harbor at Cape Town was expanded and modernized, making it one of the most important ports in the British Empire. The families who had financed the takeover became some of the wealthiest people in the Southern Hemisphere. But the long-term consequences were far more complex and far more troubling. The success of the conspiracy created a template for British expansion throughout Southern Africa. When the British wanted to expand into the interior, they used the same tactics: identify local elites whose interests could be aligned with British objectives, provide financial incentives for collaboration, and present the resulting takeover as a military necessity rather than a political conspiracy. The pattern established in 1806 would be repeated in Natal, in the Transvaal, and eventually throughout the region. The British Empire's expansion in southern Africa wasn't primarily driven by military conquest. It was driven by economic conspiracy and political manipulation. Perhaps most significantly, the 1806 takeover established the principle that local elites could maintain their wealth and status by aligning themselves with imperial power even at the expense of their own people's independence. This created a class of colonial collaborators whose descendants would continue to benefit from this arrangement for generations. The social consequences were equally profound. The Dutch-speaking colonists, who had not been part of the conspiracy, found themselves marginalized in their own land. Their language was suppressed, their cultural institutions undermined, their political influence they eliminated. This created the conditions for the ethnic tensions that would plague South Africa for the next 2 centuries. The indigenous populations, who had been largely excluded from the conspiracy, faced even worse consequences. Under Dutch rule, they had at least maintained some traditional rights and territories. Under British rule, these protections were systematically eliminated in favor of policies that prioritized economic development and settler expansion. The most disturbing long-term consequence? The normalization of conspiracy and betrayal. As tools of political control, the success of the 1806 takeover demonstrated that it was possible to overthrow legitimate governments through internal subversion rather than external conquest. And this precedent would be used repeatedly by European powers throughout Africa and Asia. The real story of the 1806 British takeover of the Cape Colony reveals uncomfortable truths about how power actually changes hands in the real world. This wasn't a heroic military campaign or a clash of civilizations. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy driven by economic self-interest and political opportunism. The merchant families who sold out their own colony weren't traders motivated by ideology. They were rational actors who correctly calculated that their interests would be better served by British rule than by continued Dutch control. The Dutch officials, who collaborated with the British, weren't cowards. They were pragmatists, who recognized that resistance was futile, when the colony's own elite had already switched sides. Understanding what really happened in 1806 forces us to confront difficult questions about the nature of political power and historical truth. How many other military conquests were actually political conspiracies? How many other historical narratives have been constructed to hide uncomfortable truths about collaboration and betrayal? The story of 1806 reminds us, history is written by the winners, but it's made by the people who choose which side to support. The British didn't conquer the Cape Colony. They purchased it from people who had already decided that their own interests were more important than their country's independence. And this isn't just ancient history. The patterns established in 1806, the use of economic incentives to secure political collaboration, the creation of false narratives to justify political takeovers, the systematic suppression of evidence that contradicts official accounts. These patterns continue to shape our world today. The real lesson of 1806 isn't about military strategy or imperial ambition. It's about the price of collaboration and the power of economic interest to override political loyalty. It's about how easily the truth can be buried when it serves everyone's interest. To forget what really happened. The British takeover of the Cape Colony in 1806 was successful not because of superior military force, but because it was what the colony's most powerful people wanted. That's the truth. That has been hidden for over 2 centuries. And it's a truth that changes everything. We thought we knew about this pivotal moment in South African history.